This happened to me about 2 years into the job, but I remember it like it was yesterday. By that time, I was pretty acclimated to everything, and things had become routine. I was stationed in Brooklyn at the time, doing some routine maintenance at High Street Station. The platform was completely deserted, which was eerie. You're used to these subway stations overflowing with people, so seeing them empty and almost deserted was a strange adjustment to make. I hadn't seen anyone on the platform for hours, and it was dead silent except for the buzz of the lights and the occasional passing train. Out of nowhere, I heard a clang from somewhere down the track. It startled me so badly that I dropped my mop in shock. The sound wasn't something I was used to hearing. The best way I could describe it is the sound a rock would make if it had been dropped on a metal rail. I stopped what I was doing and looked into the tunnel, listening for any other noises. After a while, I concluded that whatever I heard had either been caused by an animal or a falling piece of cement. After all, these stations were pretty old. I went back to work, not thinking too much about the sound. About 10 minutes later, the same sound shook me from my concentration, only this time, it was probably about twice as loud. This time, I actually became a little concerned, dare I say, scared. Was it really possible that 2 chunks of the ceiling had fallen in the span of 10 minutes? I put down my supplies and walked over to the tunnel entrance, trying to be quiet. I peered into the darkness but couldn't see anything. I debated whether or not it was a good idea to call out into the tunnel and ultimately decided against it. I still figured it was nothing, but after the initial fear had worn off, I was more confused than anything. I kept trying to think of things that could make a sound like that, not once but twice. It was especially bizarre since the second sound was louder. I tried to keep my mind off the sounds and went back to work, finding a good rhythm again. I was almost done with my work on this platform and was pleased that I'd get to leave this weird station soon. As I was wrapping things up, I heard something that gave me chills. A child's voice called out for help from inside the tunnel, and he sounded like he was in distress. I instantly stopped what I was doing and made my way over to the edge of the platform. I hesitated for a few seconds before deciding that a child in anguish wasn't something my moral conscience would allow me to ignore. I walked down the steps leading onto the tracks and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking the kid if he was okay. No response. That's weird, I thought, starting to feel nervous about this encounter. Just then, the kid's voice rang out again, repeating his call for help. I yelled back, asking him if he could hear me. He responded, yes, and I asked where specifically he was. There was a brief moment of silence before he just said, in front of you, just keep walking. I really didn't want to but couldn't just leave some helpless kid all alone on those tracks. It was dangerous. I began walking forward when something dawned on me. I yelled into the darkness one more time, this time asking the kid what was wrong. An uncomfortable pause again before the kid responded, just keep walking. I didn't like that. This whole thing was off. My eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and I was able to slightly make out what was in front of me. There actually was what looked like the shadow of a kid just up the tracks. But there was something else that almost made me scream in fear, another shadow, this one much taller, obviously an adult. My blood ran cold, and I stopped dead in my tracks. This isn't happening to me, I thought. As slowly as I could, I turned around and made my way back to the platform. Luckily, I wasn't chased on the way back. The kid shouted, wait. Where are you going? Once I reached the platform, but I wasn't sticking around another second. I made my way up the stairs and called the police as soon as I got cell service. I told them everything, and police were swarming the platform in a matter of minutes. I waited to see what they turned up. After about 20 minutes of searching, they did find something chilling, a single kid's shoe just lying in the tunnel, which the police hypothesized could have signified a struggle. After hours more of searching and scouring every available database for missing children, we were told we'd receive a call if anything ever came up. It was concluded that whoever had been down there had hidden somewhere in the tunnels. I have no idea what to think of this experience. This is the best theory I can come up with. Some psycho kidnapped a child and forced him to yell for help in an attempt to lure some unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a trap, or hell, maybe it's their own kid who they're raising to also be a psycho. I can't think of any other reasonable explanation besides this one, but if I'm right, I can only imagine what that kid must be going through. This summer, I returned to the place I had always avoided going back to. Ever since leaving, I had tried my best not to return home, choosing instead to stay in my college town or travel to Europe. But this time, I had no choice. The plan was to stay for just a week and then fly to Germany. To pass the time, I woke up early each day, went hiking, watched movies, and even drove aimlessly, just to escape the boredom of being at home. On the last day, I started feeling restless and wanted to do something more exciting. In the past, my friends and I used to do some crazy things, like train hopping, an adventurous but dangerous activity. Although I had long stopped doing such risky things, on that day, the boredom and the craving for excitement surged within me again. I decided to relive those old times and drove to a secluded spot where a set of tracks often had freight trains passing through. I remembered the tracks were surrounded by thick woods, and there was a path leading to a tunnel. Beyond the tunnel was a massive bridge spanning over the water. After parking, I walked along the tracks and waited for a train. Not long after, I felt a slight vibration from the rails, signaling the train's approach. I hid and waited for the right moment. When the train passed, I picked a car that seemed easy to climb onto, grabbed the ladder, and successfully jumped aboard. As the train entered the tunnel, a chill suddenly ran through me. A strange light flashed by, making me feel uneasy. Just as I thought I was safe, a hand suddenly reached out from the darkness and grabbed my leg. Terrified, I struggled and almost fell off the train, but luckily, I held on tightly to the car. I screamed and tried to shake off the grip of the hand. The train exited the tunnel, and without thinking, I jumped off, my heart pounding. Standing in a small clearing, I replayed the events in my mind, filled with questions. What was in that tunnel? I knew the only way back to my car was through that terrifying tunnel again. As I hesitated, I heard a faint sound coming from the tunnel, like a mechanical hum or the clicking of a person's tongue. My heart tightened, knowing I had to make a decision. I pulled out my phone, pretending I had a weapon, and loudly threatened whoever was in the tunnel. To make it more convincing, I played gunshot sound effects from my phone, the sound echoing through the tunnel, sounding incredibly real. Then, without hesitation, I sprinted into the tunnel, praying that nothing would grab me again. Finally, I made it through to the other side. When I turned around, I saw another flash of light inside the tunnel. This time, I could clearly see two figures standing silently on the tracks, watching me leave. That experience made me realize that I would never take such risks again. The terror I encountered in that tunnel was enough to keep me far away from this kind of thrill-seeking adventure forever. I have always been passionate about graffiti, enjoying the act of leaving my artwork in the hidden corners of the city. While some might label me as a delinquent, I prefer to see myself as an artist. Unlike most graffiti artists, I lean toward creating my work in secluded places, far from the eyes of other artists and the public. Abandoned train cars are the perfect canvas for me, spacious, silent, and often neglected. That night, I grabbed my spray paint and headed to an old train track I had found on a map earlier that day. The night was deep, and with a spray can in hand, I began working on the rusty old train. What struck me as odd was the complete absence of graffiti on these cars, as if they had just been abandoned. I felt a surge of excitement, thinking I might be the first to leave my mark there. I quickly got into the groove, the soft hiss of the spray can echoing in the quiet night, as colors flowed smoothly onto the metal surface. Before I knew it, I had completed a few pieces and was about to move to another spot when I suddenly heard a sharp metallic clang behind me. I froze in place, my heart racing, the can in my hand stopping mid-motion. Standing there, I held my breath, trying to determine the source of the sound. After a few moments, silence returned. Maybe it was just the wind knocking something over, I told myself as I continued painting on another car. But just as I discarded an empty spray can, one of the cans was abruptly thrown back at me from the darkness, accompanied by a low, gruff voice, "Get out of here." I was terrified. Without looking back, I ran as fast as I could. My footsteps echoed in the darkness, and I could feel something chasing me, though I dared not turn around. Suddenly, a deafening gunshot rang out behind me, sending waves of fear up my spine like a venomous snake. I ran with all my might, not stopping until I had left the eerie tracks far behind and returned to my car, still shaking uncontrollably. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to return during the day. I brought a self-defense tool with me, trying to stay calm. As I stood before the train cars once again, I noticed that my graffiti had been covered by glaring red paint, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase any trace of my presence. Then, I stopped at the doorway of one of the train cars. The door was slightly ajar, and inside was a scene that made my skin crawl. In the center of the empty car sat an old wooden chair, surrounded by rusted chains and ropes strewn across the floor. The entire car reeked of disinfectant, the stench so overpowering it made me gag. Just as I tried to snap a picture of the unsettling scene, I heard another metallic clang coming from deep inside the train car. I didn't stick around to investigate. I fled the area as quickly as I could. Even now, I sometimes think back to that night, and I can almost hear the gunshot and the sound of someone chasing me. I have no idea who was after us that night, nor do I want to speculate on their intentions. One thing I do know for sure is that there's some kind of danger hidden within that train car, and I never want to return to find out the truth.